Hello, everybody. As Martina said, I'm Natasha, and my talk is about my experiences of Agile in operations teams. Before we start, I know it's the post-lunch slot. So who here is feeling a bit sleepy post-lunch? Awesome. Cool. So I'm going to do something you're all going to hate. Conferences are hard to talk to people you've never seen before. So if you can turn around, because I know everyone sits next to the people they know, and just introduce yourself to somebody you don't know, your name and what you do, that would be awesome. Hopefully you guys can catch each other later when we've got drinks, and you've got that initial introduction now. Awesome. So I'm a pretty new Scrum Master. I've never worked in software teams or in engineering teams at all before this role, and I started in about October. So talking to you now is either brave or stupid or maybe a little bit of both. So when I was preparing for this talk, I went to the experts for advice. And by the experts, I mean Google, of course. So I asked Google, how do you write the best ever conference talk? And Google gave me a great article. And it said I should try not to put too much in it. Well, I'm not very experienced in either Scrum Mastery or giving talks, so I thought that was actually pretty good advice. It said I should focus on one core idea, one thing that I want the audience to walk away and remember. So, what do I want you guys to remember? So the real reason I want to do this is to open up the conversation about Agile in operations teams. So I'm going to present you with some of the challenges that I've faced, my experiences and experiments so far, including the bad ones, so you don't have to make the same ones again. And I'm also going to present you with some of the challenges that I still face, in the hope that some of you guys, the wider Agile community, will have some ideas and solutions to help, because this is the alternative. So the next thing the article said was that I should set the scene, give context, and grab the audience's attention. Before I go into that, I just wanted to say that New Voice Media is obviously a proud member of the Vonage family, but for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to talk about the business unit that I work for as NVM or New Voice Media. So if you hear me say that, I haven't forgotten Vonage. That's what's going on. So to me, there's really two core kind of stories when it comes to Agile. There's the shiny new startup model and the transformation of something a little bit older. Now, from what I've read and seen, a lot of stories you hear will start with this, the beginning and the end. It's kind of a sexy story, right? But what I want to focus on is that really kind of messy, unsexy bit in the middle. So NVM definitely fits into the something slightly older model. So we are a multi-tenant, multi-channel cloud contact service provider, which is really hard to say. And we've developed into that position since our birth in the sort of late 1990s. And what that means is we've got a lot of history. And that history lives in our code base, in our infrastructure, and in our culture. One of those core things, those historical facts, is that our development and our operations teams are separate. To give you a flavour of the sorts of things that we manage as a kind of complete technology team, we handle 1.5 billion call minutes per year globally, 700,000 call legs per day on our largest node, and 1 billion API requests per day. And whilst we're doing this, we're also focusing on automating our infrastructure, and last but very much not least, providing, coming up with great new products to compete in the market for our customers. But all this needs looking after. So right now, it kind of makes sense to have two different sides of the department, one of which his core priority is making sure we've got a stable system for our customers and we're providing great service. But as we develop, there's more and more cross-fertilization happening. So platform or operations teams are writing infrastructure as code, And development teams are starting to own their services end to end. There's even a rota for development teams to go on call. So as the boundaries blur a little bit, it makes sense to kind of take those opportunities to maximize the speed and quality of delivery. And it also makes sense to bring the teams closer together in terms of how they plan, how they work, and how they deliver value to our customers. That doesn't mean, however, that there isn't any tension. So as we all strive towards this idea of a DevOps culture, I think we quite often forget that that has to start with two very separate cultures, quite often, and historically somewhat conflicting. I say conflicting because there is a healthy conflict between the main priorities of the departments. On the one side, you've got development teams who are really focusing on building new products as fast as we can to kind of compete with the market and come up with innovative solutions. Whereas on the operations side, that number one priority is keeping everything stable, but also keeping the costs under control and making things easier and faster for developers. So they're complementary, but there is a certain level of conflict there. Why so slow? Why so fragile? So hopefully that gives you guys a little bit of context. And hopefully I still have most of your attention. If not, just so you know, I'm giving out free chocolate right now. No one? Cool. So the next thing my Google article told me is that I should break the next section down, tell you guys the core idea that I want you to take away, give some examples, some evidence, and tell a story. So the first thing I think you guys need to know is why. Why do I think that Agile methods and techniques are useful for operations teams? We all know they come from the software world. The first one, and I think we'll probably all have seen this at some point, the first reason is to align. So to really reap the benefits of aligning the way that we prioritize and plan our work and also get feedback on our work. So this is a pretty famous one from Spotify. If you haven't seen it, go and check it out on YouTube. But what we're really looking at is the best way to get to a goal as a series of teams. And this is really important when you've got teams with dependencies on each other. How do you look to that, to create that alignment in a team, whilst also giving them the opportunity to flex and be slightly different? Oh, I don't know what's going on there. We're all good. Anyway, I'll carry on. The second reason is that Agile's really good at making value visible. And a lot of what operations teams do, it often feels like slides underneath the radar. So this is one way of helping the business to really understand and to helping the operations teams to articulate what they're doing in terms of business value, which kind of demystifies the whole kind of super technical department and helps everyone understand the value. I had a really cool slide for the next one. The third reason is that it also helps us to make incremental, just enough improvements to our infrastructure. So it means that although we're investing small amounts at a time, so the business is able to see the long-term potential benefits of that, and also break that short and pivot if we need to. And that's particularly important in operations teams because that capacity for forward-thinking work is much lower. So arguably that importance of being able to pivot and deliver work in really small chunks is even more important to keep the rest of the department flowing. I don't know what's going on now. So now for some stories. So as a new Scrum Master joining my first teams, I had a number of assumptions that I took into how I would approach the work. But my first teams were operations teams. And so I found bit by bit that I needed to adapt my ideas based on the context and get a little bit creative. The first assumption I made was that teams would understand all of the Agile terminology. What I actually found was that my teams found a lot of the terminology quite alienating. The reason being it talked a lot about the customer, who, to be honest, they felt like there were several degrees of separation away from. Things like epics, which sounded like a weird word for them, and another admin step in Jira, and don't even get them started on story points. To those guys, a lot of the ways that we both described and implemented Agile in the business were very much geared towards the software teams. And so they kind of thought, well, why should I trust that this is meant for me and that this is going to provide any benefit for me? So my challenge was to help remove those kind of negative jargon associations, build the trust of the team, and really show the guys, how the ideas that I was talking about could benefit them and their goals. So what did I do? The first thing I wanted to do is to get the guys a little bit closer to who their customers were, and really identify those relationships. So I ran a session with my team and I asked them, who do you provide value to with your work, either inside or outside of the business? And through that, they identified all of this. So we've got a number of, as you can see, we had a bit of fun with the pictures. So we identified all of these different things, and I was amazed by the breadth of the impact of the team and how little to that point the guys themselves had acknowledged that. And what this really helped to do was for those guys to identify their own impacts within the department, wider than just being this idea of a service team, but also to identify their internal customers, which was really crucial because it opened up new conversations. It meant that they could go and ask a certain group of people, is this what you want? Is this what you're after? And we could really start, and when I was asking the team to describe their work in terms of business value, when we were going to, for example, a PI planning session, one of those wider scaled sessions, they had personas in their minds that they could then go away and use for that. So the next assumption I made was that my teams would have dedicated product owners who would help to maintain the backlog and refine priorities. So neither of my teams had dedicated product owners in the end. And initially, I found that quite difficult because I found it difficult to A, understand what the work was, and B, understand the system that the team were using to prioritize their work. But what my teams did have were these ideas of a proxy product owner. So in our situation, that's the team lead. But these guys have multiple roles, right? So they're the team leads, they're also the technical leads on the team, and they're the manager of the team, of all the members of the team. So they've got a lot of things on their plate, and actually their capacity to spend time being that product owner was much reduced. So what I did, I set up a one-on-one session each week with each of the team leads. And we used this time to, A, do a bit of backlog admin, because in our workflow management system, things were getting a bit messy. B, for those guys to really help me understand what the work was and to help them practice describing it in terms of business value. I'm totally non-technical. It wasn't going to work otherwise. But also make some priority calls about the next sprint. So initially, these sessions were pretty high on the Jira admin. And what you're seeing here is the cycle time for one of my teams over a long period. I'm going to use my laser pointer. So these little guys, the outliers, looking into them, a lot of them are the result of kind of backlog admin. So things that we hadn't necessarily found. But through these sessions, we were finding them, closing them, and as a result, we're now in a situation where we can look at the team's data and it's a lot more representative of what's actually going on. So as the sessions kind of moved on and the backlog was tamed, those sessions turned more into those priority discussions, but also into coaching. And that was really important because those guys were really influential members within the team. So they really helped me to introduce things such as story point estimation. Cool. So my third assumption was that all the work we were working on could be seen on one big priority list, which we do have as a department, the overall priority list, we've talked about it. It wasn't actually the case, and actually let me go back to this amazing slide I wanted to talk about. This guy, okay. So on the left is a development team, and on the right is an operations team. And this gives you an idea of the percentage of lifecycle work versus roadmap work. And you can see the roadmap work, the percentage for an operations team is much less. So we're looking at about 25% of the time to work on things that are actually on that list. So the other stuff was a little bit difficult to place when it came in. It's like, what do you do, for example, when an incident happens? You know you've got to respond immediately, but how do you fit that in with the other priorities? And there was also a bunch of stuff underneath this title, business as usual. And that's where I decided to focus my attention. What is this business as usual? What's within it? So I looked at it with the team, the historical data. And what we found was actually that a lot of these pieces of work, labelled as business as usual, were contributing directly to shipping new product features. But they just weren't visualised in that way or linked into them. And there were two main problems with this. Firstly, it meant that when the team did have capacity, so when that 30% of time opened up for the team to pick up the next thing, it wasn't really clear what should be next. It was quite an unwieldy list of things to manage. But it also meant that the business wasn't taking into account this extra effort that was required to ship features. It wasn't all linked into the same thing. So what did I do? Just to give you a brief overview, this is kind of how we split down our work, not Pac-Man, into MVM. So we have the feature, that text has changed, which is the largest chunk of work. And this is split down into epics, which are deliverable chunks of value within that provide value within themselves and contribute to the larger feature. And then underneath that, stories, tasks, bugs. So what I asked the guys to do was to think about the larger chunks of work that were sliding into this BAU category and define them in terms of value to that internal customer who was creating the actual product feature. And I asked them to define that as an epic and link it into the features. And what this meant was, when the team had that capacity open up, it was much clearer what work they should pick up next. But it also meant that the work was really visible to everyone else in the department, and it was clear the effort that was going in. The next assumption I made was that the teams would have all of their ceremonies embedded, and I could just kind of walk in and refine them. Naive, I know. So not to go too much into methodology, but at MVM we have the freedom to be a little bit methodology agnostic. So we do whatever works for the team, whether that's Scrum, Kanban, Scrumban, Pink Elephant methodology, anything that makes sure that the team is focusing on delivering value and continuously improving. So what that means for my teams right now is that we have a retrospective every 2 weeks, a planning session every week, and stand-ups every day. But it didn't start like that. To begin with, my teams were trying to do a planning session and a retrospective together in 1 hour each week. And the retro was always in the second half of the session. And what that meant was quite often the retro didn't happen. And the session would often also be cancelled if someone was away or things got a bit busy. So for me, looking at this, I thought, wow, my team don't necessarily see the value in this. But initially I thought, maybe it's an engagement thing. Maybe they're just not looking forward to it and enjoying the sessions. So the first thing I did was to set aside an hour, dedicated hour every 2 weeks for the retrospectives to happen. And I wanted to make them really fun and get the guys to give the guys license to be a bit silly and step out of their usual context. So a couple of the silly ideas that I came up with. So one of them, I asked the guys to build a representative of the last sprint out of Lego. That led to some interesting conversations. We had another session where one of my teams, who were very into DIY, asked them to imagine they were building or renovating a kitchen for an elderly lady and what the work would be to break that down and to flow it through. And then this one was a 6 thinking hats retrospective in which each hat represented a different way of looking at the last sprint, whether that be, the ginger beard being positive things that happened, or the flat cap being things you got a bit grumpy about. So this was really good in that it energized the team, and they really wanted to turn up because they wanted to see what I was going to do next, basically. But the problem with that was, although it was energizing, we often came up with actions that weren't necessarily then completed. So in the long term, the team were excited about it, but they weren't seeing the long-term progress and value. So what did I do? I wanted to take this problem back to the teams. So in the next retro, I ran a session on the theory behind retrospectives, what my role was in them and what their roles were. So we spent the first half talking about that. The second half, I then asked the team to look at the ailments, so what was currently wrong with our retrospectives, but then also the cures, their ideas for fixing them. And I was amazed at actually how similar they both were. So one of the things that both of my teams said was, God, the context change is so hard. We're deep in this technical work, or we're in a different meeting talking about something else, and you want us to walk in and think reflectively? I need time to adjust. And then the second thing was that we always came out with too many actions, they felt, and that they didn't go into our workflow management system or our sprint, so they didn't get done. So the couple of ideas that the guys came up with, firstly, both teams said, we'll take no more than 2 actions out of each retrospective, and we'll put them into our workflow management system, Jira, and we'll plan them into the sprint. So we're doing that, and it's awesome. They get done. It's cool. The second thing to kind of deal with that context switch is each team's now come up with a little sprint review activity at the beginning of the sprint. Sorry, at the beginning of the retro. For one team, this looks at reviewing Slack, the messaging system, and looking back at all the GIFs, which is an idea stolen directly from another team, James. And for the other team, it means finding a short video, a piece of music, a talk, a clip, and playing that. It might be totally irrelevant to what we're doing, but it gets the guys to completely switch off from what they were doing beforehand and get into that mindset. My next assumption was that the teams would know each other really well. One of my teams was pretty new, and I noticed that when one of them was away, some work would get kind of, it would sort of stall in the system, it wouldn't progress. And I wondered what was kind of behind this, but the first thing I wanted to do was surface the problem to the team. So I ran an exercise with them, which was a chaos exercise. Here we go. Came up with some scenarios, such as someone had won the lottery and was going on a trip for a year, so you've lost them, bye. And then we tried to plan the next sprint in this imaginary scenario. Now, this really highlighted the problem to the teams, but what it didn't necessarily have was any lasting impact on the actions that the teams were taking. I wanted them to be pairing more and learning from each other. So I wondered, is there a bit more at work here? And I thought to myself, what do I actually know about these guys? Not much. And I wondered if that might be the same for them. Like, how well did they know each other personally? Did they feel comfortable asking someone to pair with them and sit and work with them for a couple of hours? So I decided to test this theory out and ran a team building session. So I asked the team to answer a couple of questions. Firstly, what's your favourite film? What's your favourite food? What's a life goal that you're working on right now? How do you de-stress from work? And some really interesting things came out of it. So, firstly, we discovered that 2 of the team members had the same favourite movie, Top Gun, and they'd both walked around with Walkmans listening to the theme tune in their youth. We also found out that one of the guys on the team had recently got engaged, and none of us even knew. So my theory that the team didn't know each other really well kind of stood. And since then, we've kind of moved on. We're getting to know each other better since that icebreaker, and the team have really started working together more. We started pairing, and and we kind of know each other a bit better. The team are also really deliberate about teaching each other the new things that they're learning. And this is an awesome start. There's a way to go, but there we go. So the last one I'm going to talk to you about, my last story, is a large cross-team project we've been working on to automate our infrastructure. To give you an idea of the scale, this so far has involved 2 features, so it's the largest element we work on, with 7 more to come, 42 epics to date, with more to come. And so far it's involved 9 teams, although I think that's probably larger since I wrote this. So initially, the teams could work by themselves. They were automating their specific part of the platform. But as time went on, it became clear that teams were really going to need to collaborate pretty well to make this work and to bring everything together. And initially I'd sort of thought, well, maybe this kind of project has happened before. So I said to my teams, well, go and talk to people when you need to, have the discussion. And I kind of thought no more of it at that point. As time went on, it became clear that this was going to be something a little bit more difficult, however. There had been a number of differences of opinion over technical implementation, and teams were starting to make decisions in silos, which were impacting other teams. So it couldn't go on. This was clearly a level of collaboration, a kind of level up from what we were doing. So what we did was to run a retrospective after the first kind of phase of the project. And we asked the guys to focus specifically on the collaboration element. How are you going to work together? So how was the collaboration across this project? And how are you going to work together in the future to make this better? And they came up with some cool ideas. Firstly, the guys said they wanted to do demos to the rest of the department. So they wanted to work together towards something shorter than the overall project. And they wanted to show their work to the rest of the department. And that's been cool. We've been doing it. I think there's some more coming up shortly. But it means everyone is aligned on a certain endpoint, so even though all the teams have slightly different kind of sprints, etc. The second idea was the cross-team stand-up. So this kind of scrum of scrum things. It can involve anyone in the team who's working on the project at the time, and they all come together once a day to do what we usually do at stand-ups. Talk about anything that's blocking them, talk about upcoming dependencies on each other, surface any unmade decisions that maybe need a little bit more digging down into, and talking about challenges. It also means that myself and a couple of other people can then go and help unblock people and really start to solve some of the problems before they become desperate. So that brings me to the end of my stories. But as promised, I want to share some of the challenges that I still face. I'm hoping you guys can help. So I'm going to hit you with 3. Firstly, we talked about this idea of the proxy product owner and having those other roles. But some of those other roles can also be somewhat conflicting. So recently, I ran a safety check. Does everyone know what a safety check is? I'm seeing some nodding. Cool. No? I'm saying, okay, so safety check is when you ask your team to tell everyone, so you basically ask your team anonymously whether they feel safe to say anything within that kind of group. But I was so conscious in this that the line manager of all the people in that room was sat there doing it with them. And they're an integral part of the team, but how can you be 100% sure that those people are comfortable to even kind of be safe, to say whether or not they're safe in that situation? The second thing is, as we've seen, there's a small kind of percentage of time available for this roadmap work. And as a team with lots of dependencies, so lots of different people jostling for your time, the impact of changes in priority can have a real flow-on effect on everybody else. And this is something that I'm really trying to dig into right now. One of the things we're doing is trying to break work down into smaller chunks, to really enable us to pivot. But if anyone's got any other ideas, please, would love them. And the third one is this idea of working on the boundary between kind of the agile part of the business and the less agile part of the business. And in operations, I think we find we are kind of on that boundary. So it can be a challenge when you know work's important that's coming from another area of the business, but you're just not quite sure what to do with it and how to prioritize it and fit it in with everything else. So again, I think a lot of the things we've heard about today in terms of educating the rest of the business and showing them how important or how impactful some of the techniques can be is a great solution. But anything else, we'd love to hear about it. So the last thing my Google article told me is that I should think about where I want to end up. I should reiterate my core message or leave you guys with a call to action. What I wanted to end on, really, is that I think the things I've talked about will be familiar to a lot of you, whether or not you've worked in operations teams. There are differences, but the core challenges of bringing Agile into any team are pretty similar. And any team requires creativity, pragmatism, patience, and trust to introduce new ideas. The important thing is the ability to experiment, reflect, recognize what works and what doesn't, whatever methodology you're using. So if you're thinking about bringing Agile into your operations teams, or any other team for that matter, but think it's not going to work because the language is different or the processes just don't fit, I'd say give it a go. It will be messy, but that's okay. Awesome. Thank you guys for listening. Please get in contact.